The crystalline spires of the Galactic Council headquarters pierced the violet sky of Nexus Prime like frozen lightning, their surfaces reflecting the chaos unfolding within. Emergency klaxons wailed through corridors that had known peace for over 3 millennia, their piercing screams echoing off walls that had witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared the Council for what they were witnessing now. Ambassador Vextar's clawed hands shook as he gripped the edge of the holographic display console, his reptilian features, normally composed with the dignity of his ancient bloodline, were twisted with something between fascination and pure terror. The data streaming across the luminous screens defied every law of galactic warfare, every principle of civilized conflict that had governed the stars for eons. "Show me again," he growled, his voice carrying the weight of disbelief that had settled in his chest like a stone. His aide, a mantis-like being named Clichter, whose compound eyes could process visual data at superhuman speeds, hesitated for just a moment. Even for a species that had evolved to witness the impossible, what they were seeing transcended comprehension. The hologram flickered to life with crystalline clarity, projecting the siege of New Dakota in three-dimensional horror. The human colony world hung in space like a wounded animal, its surface scarred by plasma bombardments that should have ended the conflict within hours. According to every military protocol in the Galactic Codex, the defenders should have activated their surrender mechanisms after the first devastating assault. But here's where the story takes an impossible turn. The humans kept fighting. Vextar. Secondary heart began racing as he watched Marine Jake Morrison dragging himself across the rubble-strewn battlefield. Plasma burns covered 60% of his body, his left arm hung useless at his side, and medical scanners showed internal injuries that would have killed most species instantly. Yet there he was, still manning the barrier wall, still coordinating defensive fire, still refusing to acknowledge the mathematical certainty of defeat. "By the ancient codes," whispered Clichter, his antennae trembling with nervous energy. His pain receptors should have triggered involuntary submission cycles ago. How is he still conscious? The display zoomed in on another impossible scene. Colonel Beth Turner, her ammunition depleted hours ago, was using her plasma rifle as a club against Krell warriors twice her size. Her tactical armor was shredded, her face streaked with blood and smoke. But her eyes, those terrifyingly human eyes, burned with something the Council had never encountered before. Pure, unyielding defiance. "This violates every principle of evolutionary biology," Vextar muttered, his scientific mind reeling. Every civilized species in the galaxy possessed what xenobiologists called the preservation protocol, a biological safeguard hardwired into their neural pathways. When death became statistically inevitable, when pain exceeded survivable thresholds, when defeat was mathematically certain, the protocol activated automatically. It was evolution's ultimate gift, the wisdom to surrender and live rather than fight and die. It was what separated civilized beings from mindless beasts. But humans, they seemed to lack this fundamental programming entirely. The holographic display shifted to show the timeline of the siege. Hour 1. Krell forces landed with overwhelming superiority. Hour 6. Human casualties exceeded 50%. Hour 12. All tactical advantages lost. Hour 24. Medical facilities destroyed. Supply lines severed. Remaining human forces should have been biologically incapable of organized resistance. Yet here they were, 72 hours later, still fighting. "Perhaps their surrender mechanism is simply delayed," Clichter suggested, his voice carrying the desperate hope of someone trying to make sense of the impossible. "Some species have extended neural processing times. Maybe humans just need more time too." 72 hours? Vextar's voice cracked like breaking glass. No species in galactic history has ever fought beyond the point of biological impossibility for more than 18 hours. These humans have been fighting for 3 standard days without a single surrender signal, without a single white flag, without a single plea for mercy. The implications crashed over him like a tidal wave of liquid nitrogen. If humans couldn't surrender, if they were biologically incapable of recognizing when defeat was inevitable, then they weren't just another warrior species. They were something far more dangerous, a civilization that would fight until extinction. And in their death throes, they would drag half the galaxy down with them. But wait, it gets worse. The display showed casualty reports from other human conflicts across the sector. The defense of Titan, where human forces held off superior numbers for 6 months while completely cut off from resupply. The Battle of Kepler Station, where human civilians, had turned their mining equipment into weapons and fought, trained military forces to a standstill. The Siege of New Harmony, where human children had been found carrying ammunition to the front lines, their young faces set with the same inexplicable determination that seemed to define their entire species. "They're not just broken," Vexstar whispered, his voice barely audible above the continuing wail of the emergency klaxons. "There's something else entirely. Something that evolution should have eliminated millions of years ago." Clickter-esque compound. Eyes focused on a particular data stream. "Ambassador, look at this." The psychological profiles show that humans don't just refuse to surrender, they seem to become more determined as their situation becomes more hopeless. Their combat effectiveness actually increases when facing extinction. The revelation hit Vexstar like a meteor strike to the soul. These weren't warriors driven by honor or glory or even survival instinct. These were beings who had somehow turned their greatest weakness into their greatest weapon. Their refusal to surrender wasn't a flaw, it was their defining characteristic. And that made them the most dangerous force the galaxy had ever encountered. The emergency session would convene within the hour. 49 species would gather to decide the fate of humanity. But as Vexstar stared at the holographic display showing Jake Morrison still fighting, still refusing to quit, still defying the very laws of nature itself, he realized they weren't just dealing with another species, they were dealing with something that shouldn't exist and that made them. It's absolutely terrifying. Speaking of things that shouldn't exist, but become incredibly powerful over time, just like compound interest in your investments, this discovery would compound the Council's problems exponentially. Check out our next video on the power of compounding to see how small decisions can lead to massive consequences, just like humanity's refusal to surrender was about to reshape the entire galaxy. The Great Assembly Hall had witnessed the birth of star empires and the peaceful resolution of species-ending conflicts. But nothing had prepared its soaring crystalline architecture for the waves of pure terror now rippling through its sacred chambers. Representatives from 49 species sat in their designated atmospheric pods, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of fear that would have been beautiful if it weren't so utterly terrifying. The massive holographic display dominated the center of the hall like a window into humanity's soul, and what it showed defied every law of civilized warfare. Captain Mike Rodriguez stood atop the smoking ruins of Firebase Alpha, his military uniform hanging in tatters, crimson blood streaming down his face in rivers of defiance. His left shoulder was dislocated, his right leg barely supporting his weight, and thermal scans showed internal injuries that should have rendered him unconscious hours ago. Yet there he was, barking orders into his communicator, coordinating defensive positions, orchestrating what could only be described as tactical genius born from desperate fury. The firebase had been under siege for 9 consecutive days, and Rodriguez hadn't slept for the last 4. They'd been fighting for 9 days straight, reported General Thakmar, its massive tusks grinding against each other in a display of frustration that his species reserved for the most impossible situations. The Valorian military commander had personally led campaigns across 17 star systems, had witnessed the rise and fall of warrior cultures that prided themselves on their battle prowess, but what he was seeing now challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare. 9 days, repeated, his voice carrying the weight of disbelief. My own warriors bred for combat, trained from birth, enhanced with military-grade neural implants would have surrendered after 9 hours facing those casualties. The human losses exceed 90%. Their supply lines are severed, their medical facilities destroyed, and they're still fighting. But here's where it gets really interesting. The humans weren't just surviving. They were adapting. The display zoomed in on a group of human civilians who had somehow transformed their mining equipment into weapons of war. Children, actual children, were running ammunition to the front lines, their young faces set with the same inexplicable determination that seemed to define their entire species. A woman named Jennifer Walsh, a botanist by training, was leading a squad of defenders armed with nothing but improvised explosives and pure human stubbornness. Ambassador Cryonic, his scaled hide shimmering with the nervous energy patterns that indicated extreme anxiety in his species, leaned forward in his atmospheric pod. Surely there must be some explanation. Perhaps their pain receptors are damaged. Maybe their neural pathways are simply primitive, responded the Council's chief xenobiologist, a floating entity whose consciousness existed in pure energy form. We've analyzed their biology extensively. Their pain receptors are actually more sensitive than most species. They feel everything, every wound, every loss, every moment of agony. They're not fighting because they can't feel pain. They're fighting despite feeling all of it. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembly. Pain was supposed to be evolution's ultimate teacher, the biological mechanism that prevented species from destroying themselves through pointless conflict. But humans seem to have turned this fundamental law of nature on its head. Council Prime Veltar, ancient beyond measure and wise beyond calculation, slowly raised her luminescent tentacles for silence. Her species had overseen galactic peace. For over 4 millennia, had guided the evolution of interstellar law, had prevented countless wars through the application of logic and reason. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of civilizations. "We have reached a conclusion," she announced, her words resonating through the chamber's quantum acoustic system. "The human species lacks the fundamental surrender protocol that prevents extinction-level conflicts. They are not merely dangerous, they are a threat to galactic stability itself." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the atmospheric recyclers seemed to hold their breath as the implications sank in. Species that couldn't surrender was like a star that couldn't die eventually. It would consume everything around it. "What do you propose?" asked Ambassador Cryonic, though his tone suggested he already feared the answer. Veltar's response came with the certainty of mathematical law: genetic modification. "We will install surrender protocols in their neural pathways. They will be ... corrected." The word corrected hung in the air like a death sentence. Now, you might think this sounds reasonable, right? After all, they're just trying to help humanity avoid extinction. But here's the thing. The Council was essentially proposing to lobotomize an entire species, to strip away the very essence of what made them human. The chamber erupted in discussion. The Merchant Guild representatives cheered the solution, seeing it as a way to finally bring humanity into the galactic economy without the constant threat of warfare. The Scientific Coalition worried about the precedent of forced genetic modification. The Spiritual Assembly questioned whether they had the right to alter another species, its fundamental nature. But notice something crucial: not a single representative questioned the necessity of the action. They all agreed that humanity in its current form was too dangerous to exist. 3 days later, the ultimatum reached Earth through official diplomatic channels. The message was delivered simultaneously to every human government, every military command, every civilian authority across their scattered colonies. The language was formal, diplomatic, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Submit to genetic modification or face complete quarantine from galactic civilization. The human response came within hours, transmitted on every frequency, broadcast, from every world, delivered with a unity that the galaxy had never seen before.
Oh.
No debate, no political maneuvering, no negotiation. Just 3 words that would echo through the stars for generations to come. Go to hell. And just like that, humanity had declared war on the entire galaxy. The Council representatives sat in stunned silence as they processed this response. In their millions of years of diplomatic history, no species had ever rejected such an ultimatum. The logical response was compliance, or at worst, negotiation. But humans, they chose defiance. They chose to remain human, whatever the cost. Speaking of costs compounding over time, this single decision would multiply into consequences that would reshape the entire galaxy. Just like how small investments can grow into massive fortunes through the power of compound interest. This moment of defiance would compound into something far greater than anyone could imagine. Check out our next video on the power of compounding to see how small decisions can lead to universe-changing results. 2 miles beneath the granite peaks of Colorado Springs, in a war room that had been carved from solid rock during humanity's nuclear age, the fate of an entire species hung in the balance. The chamber hummed with the quiet desperation of leaders who had been backed into an impossible corner. Its reinforced walls bearing witness to a decision that would echo through the stars for millennia. General Lisa Parker's weathered hand crashed down on the metal briefing table with the force of a meteor impact, sending star charts and tactical displays scattering like leaves in a hurricane. Her knuckles were white, her jaw set with the kind of determination that had carried humanity from the caves of Africa to the outer rim of the galaxy. Around her, the joint chiefs of humanity's scattered colonies sat in stunned silence, their faces reflecting the same barely contained rage that burned in her steel-gray eyes. "They want to lobotomize us," she snarled, her voice carrying the kind of fury that could melt titanium. "Turn us into compliant sheep who roll over when the wolves come calling." The holographic display above the table showed the Council's ultimatum in cold clinical detail. Genetic modification protocols, neural pathway alterations, surrender mechanism installation. The scientific language couldn't mask what it really was, the systematic elimination of everything that made humanity human. Admiral Tom Bradley, his face weathered by decades of void warfare and political battles, leaned forward across the table. His expression was hard as asteroid rock, carved by the kind of experiences that would have broken lesser men. "The genetic modification would fundamentally alter human nature," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "We'd survive, but we wouldn't be human anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. These were men and women who had faced down alien invasions, navigated political crises that could have shattered civilizations, and made decisions that affected billions of lives. But nothing had prepared them for this moment, the choice between survival and identity. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," muttered Colonel David Hayes from his connection aboard the Tau Ceti colony ship. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the oppressive quiet of the war room it might as well have been a shout. "If it means peace," the words hung in the air like a lit fuse. "Da, da." And Parker's response came with the explosive force of a plasma cannon. "Peace." Her eyes blazed with something that transcended mere anger. It was the kind of primal fury that had driven humanity's ancestors to fight saber-toothed tigers with nothing but sharpened sticks. "You mean slavery? You mean watching our children grow up as neutered pets in their galactic zoo?" But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Hayes wasn't wrong to be afraid. The secondary display flickered to life, showing real-time intelligence feeds from the border of human space. The Council enforcement fleets were massing like storm clouds before a hurricane, their numbers growing by the hour. Thousands of ships, each one capable of sterilizing a planet, each one crewed by beings who had never known the kind of desperate determination that defined the human spirit. "Look at the numbers," Hayes continued, his voice gaining strength as fear gave way to logic. "They outnumber us 1,000 to 1. Our colonies are scattered, our fleets are divided, and our technology is centuries behind theirs. This isn't bravery, it's suicide." The math was undeniable. Smart play was surrender. The logical choice was modification. The rational decision was to accept the Council's terms and hope that future generations would understand why their ancestors had chosen survival over principle. But humans had never been particularly rational. Parker stood slowly, her chair scraping against the concrete floor with a sound like grinding bones. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every human who had ever stood against impossible odds. Every ancestor who had chosen to fight rather than flee. Every generation that had passed down the stubborn refusal to bow to tyranny. We didn't claw our way out of caves, survive ice ages, and reach the stars by giving up when things got tough, she declared. We didn't build this civilization by rolling over every time someone told us we were too dangerous to exist. The holographic display shifted to show humanity's history, the migration out of Africa, the survival of the last ice age, the rebuilding after nuclear war, the first tentative steps into space. Each moment had been a choice between the safe path and the hard one, between surrender and defiance. They're offering us the chance to live as something else, Parker continued, her voice rising with passion. To become the kind of species that fits neatly into their galactic order. But that's not living, that's existing. It's accepting that we're broken when the truth is, we're exactly what we're supposed to be. Admiral Bradley nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. They see our refusal to surrender as a flaw, but it's not a bug, it's a feature. It's what carried us through every dark age, every extinction event, every moment when survival meant refusing to quit. The debate that followed was fierce but brief. Other voices joined the discussion: generals from Mars, admirals from the outer colonies, civilian leaders from the asteroid belt. Some argued for negotiation. Others suggested a fighting withdrawal. A few even endorsed Hayes's position that survival trumped principle. But when the vote was called, the result was as inevitable as sunrise. Unanimous. Humanity would remain human. Whatever the cost, the silence that followed was different from before, the oppressive quiet of desperation. But the calm before the storm? These leaders had just signed their species' death warrant, and they all knew it. But they'd also chosen to die as humans rather than live as something else. If they want to change what we are, Parker said quietly, her voice carrying the finality of a closing coffin, they'll have to kill us first. The message went out within the hour, transmitted on every frequency, broadcast to every human world, delivered with the kind of unity that the galaxy had never seen before. No political maneuvering, no diplomatic hedging, no room for misinterpretation. Humanity's answer was simple. We choose to remain human. The Council enforcement fleets received their orders 12 hours later. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, designed to distance the decision-makers from the blood that would follow. Pacify the humans by any means necessary. What followed would become known as the impossible war, a conflict that would prove that sometimes the greatest strength comes from refusing to surrender, even when surrender is the only logical choice, just like how compound interest seems impossible at first, investing small amounts that grow into massive fortunes over time. Humanity's refusal to surrender would compound into something far greater than anyone could imagine. Check out our next video on the power of compounding to see how small acts of defiance can reshape entire galaxies. The Battle of Titan shattered every military doctrine the galaxy had developed over 3 million years of civilized warfare. What began as a routine pacification operation became the stuff of nightmares, a testament to what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. And the immovable object refuses to acknowledge the laws of physics. Captain Robert Bull Mason stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, his weathered hands gripping the command rail as Saturn's largest moon filled the viewport like a wounded giant. Behind him, the scattered remnants of humanity's Third Fleet prepared for what every tactical computer had calculated as certain annihilation. 300 human ships, most of them converted civilian vessels, hastily armed with mining lasers and improvised armor, faced the Council's first armada, 3,000 alien vessels stretched across space like a metallic constellation of death. Dreadnoughts the size of cities, their hulls bristling with weapons that could crack planets. Cruiser squadrons that had pacified entire star systems. Fighter wings that moved with the precision of a single organism. The mathematics were brutally simple. Humanity was about to be erased from existence. Bull's communication officer, a young woman named Sarah Chen, whose hands shook as she monitored the tactical displays, looked up with barely contained terror. "Sir, they're demanding our surrender. They're offering terms. Bull's laugh was like grinding metal. The only terms they understand are the ones we're about to give them. He keyed the fleet-wide communication channel, his voice carrying across the void to every human soul preparing to die. All ships, this is Bull. Today, we show these bastards what happens when you threaten the human race. The Council commanders aboard their flagship expected what they had seen in every previous engagement token: resistance, followed by inevitable surrender. Their xenobiological experts had run the calculations. Human neural chemistry couldn't sustain combat effectiveness beyond a certain threshold of hopelessness. The surrender protocol might be absent, but biological reality would assert itself. We're about to learn that humans had spent millennia rewriting the rules of biological reality. What followed would haunt galactic nightmares for centuries to come. Humans who fought like cornered animals but with the tactical brilliance of apex predators. The first wave of human ships didn't attempt to engage in traditional naval combat. Instead, they turned themselves into kinetic weapons, accelerating at maximum burn toward the Council formation. Lieutenant Commander Amy Walsh, piloting the destroyer U.S. Retribution, watched her targeting computer calculate the impossible geometry of her final moments. Her ship was dying around her, hull breaches venting atmosphere like tears in space itself. But her eyes burned with something that transcended mere determination. "This is Retribution," she broadcast on all frequencies, her voice carrying the weight of every human who had ever stood against impossible odds. "Tell them we were here. Tell them we fought." Her destroyer slammed into the Council dreadnought. Eternal harmony with the force of a small asteroid. The explosion lit up the void like a newborn star, and when the light faded, both ships were gone. But the psychological impact rippled through the Council fleet like a shockwave. These weren't soldiers following orders. These were human beings choosing to die rather than submit. Major Chris Thompson, commanding a converted transport vessel loaded with Marine reinforcements, watched the tactical display with the calm acceptance of a man who had already made peace with death. His ship was outgunned, outmanned, and completely outclassed. But it was also carrying 300 Marines who had volunteered for what they knew was a suicide mission. "Marines," he announced over the internal com, "it's been an honor." Then he turned his transport into a kinetic weapon, launching it at enemy formations, while his Marines sang battle hymns that had echoed through humanity's bloodiest conflicts. The sound of 300 human voices raised in defiant song was broadcast across space as they plunged toward certain death. Broke something fundamental in the Council's understanding of warfare. They're not following any rational strategy. General Thakmer screamed into his communicator as another human ship exploded against his flagship's shields. The Valorian commander had fought in campaigns across 17 star systems, had studied every form of warfare known to galactic civilization. But this was beyond his comprehension. They're fighting like they want to die. But here's the thing that the Council fundamentally misunderstood. Humans weren't trying to win. They were trying to make the cost of victory too high to bear. Every human death was paid for with alien blood. Every destroyed human world took a dozen Council ships with it. The mathematics of attrition, which had always favored the side with superior numbers, suddenly became a weapon in humanity's hands. The war raged for 2 years across 17 star systems. The Council won every major engagement, captured every strategic objective, achieved every tactical goal. But each victory felt like defeat. They had expected to face a civilization-organized rationale, capable of recognizing when further resistance was futile. Instead, they were fighting a force of nature. Human colonies turned their entire infrastructure into weapons. Asteroid mining stations became kinetic bombardment platforms. Civilian freighters became suicide bombers. Children learned to build explosives from household chemicals. Grandparents piloted shuttles loaded with antimatter into Council formations. The psychological toll on Council forces was devastating. How do you fight an enemy that celebrates death? How do you negotiate with a species that would rather burn the galaxy than accept defeat? How do you maintain military discipline when every engagement becomes a horror show of pointless sacrifice? Not fighting to win, reported Council Intelligence Chief Vextar in his final dispatch before his own ship was destroyed by a human mining vessel. They're fighting to make us remember. They're fighting to prove that some things are worth dying for. The revelation came too late. Council had unleashed something they couldn't control, a war that had no rules, no limits, no possibility of rational conclusion. They had awakened humanity's greatest strength, the absolute refusal to surrender. Even when surrender was the only logical choice, the conflict would reshape the galaxy's understanding of warfare, diplomacy, and the very nature of civilization itself. But more than that, it would prove that sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning, but from refusing to lose. Just like how compound interest seems impossible at first, small investments that grow into massive fortunes through the power of persistence, humanity's refusal to surrender would compound into something far greater than anyone could imagine. Check out our next video on the power of compounding to see how small acts of defiance can reshape entire galaxies. The neutral station hung in the void like a broken promise, its scarred hull bearing witness to 2 years of the most brutal conflict the galaxy had ever witnessed. At the edge of dead space, where no stars shed light and no world claimed sovereignty, Ambassador Vexstar sat across from General Lisa Parker, in a chamber that had been carved from pure necessity and desperation. Both beings were shadows of their former selves. Vexstar's once pristine reptilian features were etched with stress lines that spoke of sleepless cycles and impossible decisions. His claws, which had once signed treaties that brought peace to entire star systems, now trembled with the weight of what he had witnessed. Parker's face was a map of scars, physical and emotional, earned through 2 years of commanding humanity's impossible war against annihilation. The silence between them was deafening. Outside the station's viewports, the wreckage of countless battles drifted in the cosmic dark, human ships twisted with alien metal, a monument to the price of refusing to surrender. The war had consumed entire star systems, turned thriving worlds into graveyards, shattered the galaxy's understanding of what civilized species were capable of. "Why?" Vexstar asked, his voice barely a whisper, carrying the weight of a question that had haunted him through months of unthinkable carnage. "Why choose extinction over evolution?" Parker's eyes, hard as titanium and twice as unforgiving, met his across the scarred metal table. The general who had led humanity's resistance bore the look of someone who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back. But there was something else there. Something that Vexstar was only beginning to understand. "Because some things are worth dying for," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute conviction. "You see our refusal to surrender as a flaw. We see it as what makes us human." The words hung in the recycled air like a challenge to the very foundations of galactic civilization. Every species in the Council had evolved past the point of such primitive thinking. They had learned that survival was the highest virtue, that adaptation was the key to longevity, that compromise was the foundation of progress. But humans had somehow turned their greatest weakness into their greatest strength. "But your species could survive," Vexstar began, his voice carrying the desperate hope of someone trying to solve an impossible equation. "As what?" Parker interrupted, leaning forward with the intensity of a predator. "As broken shadows of ourselves? As cautionary tales in your history books? As pets in your galactic zoo, trotted out when you need to remember what primitives used to look like?" The ambassador's claws scraped against the table's surface, leaving scratches that would remain long after this conversation ended. "You're willing to drag the entire galaxy into chaos for your pride? Now here's where the story takes its most important turn." Parker's response would reshape everything the galaxy thought it knew about courage, sacrifice, and the very nature of what it means to be alive. "Not pride," she corrected, her voice carrying the weight of every human who had ever stood against impossible odds. "Purpose. We're not fighting because we can't surrender. We're fighting because we're protecting something more valuable than our lives, our humanity." The revelation hit Vexstar like a plasma bolt to the consciousness. For 2 years, he had watched humans throw themselves into certain death with what he assumed was faulty programming. He had seen mothers turn their children into weapons, fathers pilot suicide ships into council formations, entire colonies choose annihilation over assimilation. But they weren't broken. They were complete. "You're not dangerous because you're defective," he whispered, understanding finally dawning in his ancient eyes. You're dangerous because you're whole. Duh. The truth that had eluded the greatest minds in galactic history was suddenly brutally clear. Humans weren't missing something, they had something that every other species had evolved away from. They possessed the one thing that made them truly unpredictable, truly dangerous, truly alive. They possessed the absolute refusal to become something they were not. Every species in the galaxy has learned to survive, Parker continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. They've learned to adapt, to compromise, to bend rather than break. But in learning to survive, they've forgotten how to live. They've forgotten that some things are worth more than existence. The war room recordings would show that this was the moment when everything changed. Not through conquest or surrender, but through recognition. The Council had spent 2 years trying to force humanity to become something else, only to discover that humanity's greatest strength lay in its refusal to change. Think about it, how many times in your own life have you've been told to compromise your values for the sake of fitting in? How many times have you been asked to become someone you're not for the promise of safety or acceptance? Humans had been asked that question on a galactic scale. Their answer had been written in blood across the stars. The war ended not with conquest, but with recognition. The Council granted humanity unprecedented autonomy, too dangerous to fight, too valuable to destroy. They became the galaxy's ultimate guardians, the ones called upon when surrender truly wasn't an option. And across the stars, other species began to whisper a new legend. When the impossible must be done, when the unthinkable must be faced, when the choice is between freedom and safety, call the humans. They never learned how to give up. And in that refusal, they found their greatest strength. The galaxy would never be the same. Species that had forgotten what it meant to stand for something beyond mere survival began to remember. The Council's perfectly ordered civilization found itself enriched by the chaotic beauty of beings who would rather die than surrender their essential nature. Humanity had won the ultimate victory not by defeating their enemies, but by remaining themselves, just like how compound interest seems. Impossible at first, small investments that grow into massive fortunes through the power of persistence, humanity's refusal to surrender compounded into something far greater than anyone could imagine. Their single decision to remain human had reshaped the entire galaxy. Check out our next video on the power of compounding to see how small acts of defiance can create universe-changing results. The end.